Who are we? This is essentially a question of identity for us as a people who are United Methodists. It's a question that is related to our past, places us in our present, and points us to the future. As United Methodists, people of Wesleyan faith and tradition, we have been a diverse people from our origins. At the historic Christmas conference in 1784, persons of diverse backgrounds gathered at Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore in covenant and community together to shape a vision of what Methodism would look like in America. Among those in attendance were at least two African Americans, Richard Allen and Harry Hoosier, with Allen and Absalom Jones being the first African Americans to receive license to preach by the newly formed Methodist Episcopal Church just about 1 year later in 1785. Notes from the African American Methodist Heritage Center point to the racial diversity in common across the church. And they say, and they quote, that the history, heritage, and hopes of United Methodists of African descent are inextricably intertwined with the history, heritage, and hopes of John Wesley's Methodism since our beginnings in North America. And yet the whole church, they say, has been slow to celebrate that linkage, perhaps due to a lack of knowledge and understanding of the story and trials and triumphs of African Americans in the church. Indeed, the challenges in living into our racial diversity, as well as other forms of diversity, have been formidable. In 1844, the split of Methodism into the northern and southern denominations was effectively an outcome of the debate over slavery and segregation embedded in the churches at the local levels, as well as early denominational structures, with most notable cases being the experience of African American worshipers at St. George Church in Philadelphia and John Street Church in New York City, where Black worshipers were effectively forced to leave their churches. The 1939 Methodist Unification Conference served to create the segregated all-Black central jurisdiction and Black annual conferences. And although the 1968 establishment of the United Methodist Church effectively disestablished the central jurisdiction and structural racism in American Methodism, the remnants of racial segregation and other forms of our struggles to live into our diversity, they remain today. The latest Pew Research data shows that the United Methodist Church in America is in fact about 94% white, with Blacks including African Americans, Latinx, Asians, and Native Americans together comprising the remaining 6% of the United Methodist Church. The racial ethnic diversity of United Methodism in America therefore does not reflect the growing diversity across the country in general, where over 37% of Americans are now non-white persons. A part of our biblical and theological imperative has been and continues to be to ask the important question, should the church be divided by race, age, gender, identity, and socioeconomic status? Most people would clearly say no. We could point to the Apostle Paul's assertion in Galatians chapter 3, where he writes, for in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, Paul says, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Furthermore, we might see God's will and desire for the church and the world today as evidenced in the words of the psalmist in Psalm 133, where it is written, how very good and how very pleasant it is for siblings to live together in unity. It is like precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord ordains God's blessing, life forevermore. And so it is clear that race continues to matter in America, and that we are not yet at the place of being post-racial or post-racist in the churches or society. Sociologist Michael Eric Dyson points to this matter in his book, Can You Hear Me Now?, where Dyson insists that the critical question that is before us as a church and society today is not if we are yet a post-racial society, and the question is not even if we should strive to become post-racial, but the critical question for us is how might we move closer to becoming post-racist as a society. The path toward healing the wounds of racism and other forms of division in the Methodist family can begin with finding ways to acknowledge and to learn from our past and to build upon the work that has been done to get us to where we are. Important work it is. In the Baltimore-Washington Conference, we can celebrate and affirm and learn from many examples, including Asbury Church in Washington, D.C., an historically Black church, still a vital congregation that was founded out of Foundry Church. We can also learn from Mount Zion Church in D.C., another historically Black church, still vital as a congregation, founded out of Dumbarton Church. We can learn from Wesley Freedom Church in Carroll County and their story of opposing slavery, where slave owners were turned away from their congregation. And we can learn from Epworth Chapel in Baltimore, a vital inter-suburban congregation in a racially, economically, and socially transitioning community where persons from over 15 nations are now a part of the regular worshiping congregation. We can learn from churches like Fairhaven and Journey of Faith churches, vital congregations which are results of merger of white and Black churches. We can learn from Waters and Brooks churches in Southern Maryland and those like them, two churches, one predominantly white and the other predominantly Black, which continue to come to grips with the legacy of race and racism in the churches and in their community. And so, how is the church today being called to deeper transformation? And how are we to combat the remnants of the sin of segregation and racism? The following 4 areas I suggest might be points that lead to further discernment and inquiry in addressing these 2 important questions. The first area is in the area of acknowledgement and affirmation. So questions are, how do we acknowledge and affirm our common creation in God? How do we then acknowledge and affirm the full humanity of all people? And in light of these, how do we acknowledge and affirm the past and present wounds of racism and other isms, name them, and then commit to proactively seeking to build community across our difference? The second area, authenticity and association. In what ways as individuals and churches might we commit to engaging and embracing our difference? How might we strive to build community based on principles of authenticity and sincerity and substantively sustained levels of human association across our difference? Thirdly, the area of articulation and aspiration. What are the collective experiences, narratives, stories, images, and metaphors that have and continue to shape our worldview and understanding of community? How might these be articulated in ways that affirm and present and point us to the future in ways that are important? Appropriation. How might we anticipate and dream into our future? And what does our future look like? How might it be that we overcome and appropriate ways of overcoming segregation and other forms of separation among us? How might we become even more inclusive and diverse than we are now into our future?